Catherine Livingstone was born in Nairobi, Kenya, probably one of the few people in the room born in Kenya today. And after spending her infancy in England, the family relocated to Sydney, where she received her early education at Loreto Normanhurst, one of the fine Loreto schools here in Australia. She undertook her further education at the Macquarie University, where she received a Bachelor of Arts with honours, and indeed was awarded an honorary doctorate in business. She spent her early career in chartered accounting and then spent approximately 20 years in the implantable devices sector, where she rose to become the managing director of the industry leader, Cochlear Limited. And that was a position that Catherine held for about 5 or 6 years. Upon stepping down from the role at Cochlear, she commenced what has, I think on any test, become quite a remarkable career as a director here in Australia. She's held board positions with a range of companies including Goodman Fielder, Rural Press and the Macquarie Group. And she's currently a director, a non-executive director of Worley Parsons. She chaired the CSIRO for approximately 5 years, and of course since 2009 has been the chairman of Telstra, and working collaboratively with David Thodey and his management team, a number of whom are here in the room today, I see, has really presided over an extraordinary period of value creation for Telstra shareholders. But Catherine, more than that, Catherine has also been an outstanding contributor to the Australian community more generally. She's taken on numerous roles with a community focus, including currently acting as the President of the Australian Museum Trust. And she was also a member of the advisory panel for the very important Australia in the Asian Century White Paper. And these are just a few of her community-minded roles that she has taken on. In 2008, as was touched on earlier by Kim, she was appointed as an officer. She was appointed to the Office of the Order of Australia for her service to the development of Australian science, technology, and innovation policies for the business sector. And of course, earlier in the year, in March this year, she was elected to the position of President of the Business Council, which is the capacity in which she addresses us today. As I said before, I'm really looking forward to hearing from Catherine, and I know that so many people here in the room, like me, admire and respect Catherine Livingstone as one of the great business people of Australia. Please welcome Catherine Livingstone.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that all too fulsome introduction. And my thanks to both sponsor organisations today and to the Australia-Israeli Chamber of Commerce for giving me the opportunity to present our very important work. I'm also delighted to see so many of our BCA CEO members here, so thank you very much for coming. So the 2014 Global Innovation Index, released by Industry Minister Ian Macfarlane 2 weeks ago, saw Australia's ranking improve from 19th in the world to 17th. The fact that this result was seen as a success rather than a call to arms really underscores the importance of the work being released today by the BCA. It was former Treasury Secretary Ted Evans who said that a nation can choose the level of unemployment which it is willing to bear. Extending this thought, we can also say that a nation chooses the living standards of its current and future generations. It is a choice made through actions taken and actions not taken, but worse, actions sidestepped. In Australia, it is time to confront our complacency and make those choices that will secure our nation's prosperity now and for future generations. The forces that are shaping our world, digital technology, significant demographic change, and globalisation are not benign. Our degrees of freedom are rapidly running out, but we do still have time just enough time to imagine and fashion our future. We need to choose now between a path of purposeful action or a path of painful adjustment. The former requires a different, more nuanced approach to keeping our economy strong and growing the wealth of our nation. It will be an approach characterised by 4 marked shifts from where we are today. And they are, firstly and most importantly, adopting a global mindset in everything we do and coming to terms with what it means to operate in a truly global marketplace. It requires returning to a more thoughtful role for government in facilitating and coordinating economic development and social progress. It involves dramatically increasing our competitiveness through innovation, and then growing those sectors of our economy that can win on a global scale and make the greatest contribution to lifting our national wealth. And we use the word wealth here quite deliberately, and we're unashamedly assuming that there is broad agreement on the need to create wealth. Wealth reflects the longer-term value of economic growth and delivers the wherewithal to reinvest. That includes government reinvesting, having the fiscal latitude to do so, particularly in skills and infrastructure. And it enables companies to reinvest in business model adaptation and transformation, and hence in sustainable job creation. So when policymakers talk about growth targets and structural reform, we need to hold them to account on 2 fronts. Are they targeting the kind of growth that creates wealth? And will the reform that they speak of actually help transform the economy? As we hear repeatedly, Australia has enjoyed more than 2 decades of uninterrupted growth. The first decade was driven by the reforms of the 1980s that opened our economy to the world. These reforms were purposeful and thoughtful. The reformers of that time were encouraged in taking this active posture by a well-timed essay written by the former Department of Finance Secretary Ian Castles. Castles argued that the reforms undertaken by the 19th century economists not only increased efficiency, but importantly, improved people's living standards. His point was that difficult economic reform is not compelling as an end in itself. It must be designed and promoted as a vehicle for enhancing social well-being. The cautionary tale from the second decade of growth, a growth underpinned by record terms of trade, is what happens when a country is exposed to both the opportunities and the risks of global engagement, but fails to manage them strategically. The resources sector recognised the need to be strategic and did what it could to maximise the broader potential of the boom through innovation. So we see, for example, the investments in production processes, remote monitoring and robotics in the Pilbara. Government, on the other hand, reacted opportunistically. And then the global financial crisis exposed the consequences of policy short-sightedness, of a pattern of government behaviour that was not focused on the long term. Had Australia been using the unprecedented terms of trade to invest in the future of the nation, when the GFC hit, we would have been prepared and in a position to channel stimulus dollars into innovation infrastructure that would now be enabling a 3rd decade of growth. Instead, more than $80 billion were spent or committed with as yet little enduring positive legacy. So, notwithstanding the growth of the past decade, where are we today? We have stagnant multi-factor productivity growth. We have an estimated catch-up sort of deficit over the next 10 years of $700 billion of public and private investment in infrastructure, and this at a time when all government budgets are under enormous strain and fiscal repair is being stalled in the Senate. We have an unemployment rate of 6%, going in the wrong direction, and we have a youth unemployment rate of 13.5%, and regions where it exceeds 20%. This is an appalling commentary on what we've achieved in the past 10 years. And then we have literacy and numeracy levels which have fallen below the OECD average. Clearly, something was wrong with the way we managed the second decade of growth. We now find ourselves having to reorientate our economy with the cupboard empty, the prospect of a worsening fiscal position if savings announced in the federal budget are not realised, and facing a conjunction of powerful global forces. The dynamics of these global forces are strong, they're at scale, and they're happening at speed. And many of them were reflected in the commentary at the recent B20 meeting in Sydney. For the first of these forces, the digital technology, the disruptive impact of this technology, which is making every sector tradable and the market for labour global. As they say in Silicon Valley, software is eating the world, and it has democratised the tools of innovation. The disruptive impact of the smartphone, first introduced in 2007, has been an accelerant in this process. The speed of innovation in digital technology, particularly, as I say, as a result of mobile broadband, means that apparently stable business models can be undermined and literally collapse, sometimes overnight. Today, sectoral and national boundaries are no protection from competition. Global competition is coming on shore at a rapid rate. We have Aldi, Amazon, Google, PayPal, and consumers are going offshore online. In fact, consumers are increasingly in charge, and Australian businesses need to be globally competitive, not just to participate in the global market, but to retain domestic customers and attract skilled employees. The second force, the impact of demographic change, has two key dimensions. First is the ageing of the population, which, as we know, will lead to higher healthcare and social welfare costs, but it will also escalate the demand on public finances as the growth in gross national income declines, and with significant long-term consequences for the adequacy of tax revenues. At the same time, we're seeing a worrying increase in youth unemployment as digital technology drives the phenomenon of jobless growth and exposes a serious mismatch between the skills and capabilities of our youth and those demanded by business. On both fronts, these demographic changes will make it increasingly difficult for government to balance the books while maintaining social well-being. And then there is the global economic transformation, but significantly, it is a transformation coupled with the strategic response of competitor nations. The rise of global value chains now means that 70% of global trade is in intermediate goods and services and capital goods rather than end products and services. We observe other countries taking a deliberate and purposeful policy approach, using areas of comparative advantage to capitalise on the growth of middle-class demand in emerging economies and/or in the growth of global value chains. And we've just heard from Chris Cuff on the approach being taken in Israel by the government in facilitating its startup sector. In New Zealand, a strategic policy intervention in the dairy industry has facilitated 12% growth per annum in total dairy exports in the last decade, compared with Australia's 0.1%. While we took a set-and-forget approach to the deregulation of the dairy industry, New Zealand was busy designing theirs for success. In China, the central government last year released a highly targeted strategy to increase the rate of growth in what it called information consumption, and it sought an average growth rate of 20% per annum. In Australia, public funding of NICTA, our National ICT Research Institute, will cease after 2016. In the US, President Obama's advanced manufacturing strategy is building on the shale gas revolution and the seeds of a turnaround in manufacturing, which has seen the creation of 600,000 jobs over the last 4 years, following decades of decline. In Australia, we have not yet even been able to provide for the environmentally responsible development of our national gas resources, risking the loss of a huge source of potential of economic growth. As a final example, speaking at the B20 a fortnight ago, the UK Trade and Investment Minister in Livingstone said that the economic resurgence in the UK could be explained in part by an industrial strategy that had invested in key sectors and key enabling technologies. We would be naive in the extreme to think that Australia is the only country chasing the growth markets of Asia. We know that other countries are securing trade with China at a faster rate than we are, even in those sectors where we have a strong presence. We cannot afford to be complacent about the need to take control of our destiny. If we don't take control, our future will unfold by default as a consequence of the actions being taken by other countries. When people talk about relying on the market to work it out, that market will be the global market, and it will be domestic jobs and domestic businesses at risk if we are not competitive at the global level. So in response to this situation, and following on from our Economic Action Plan last year, the BCA commissioned McKinsey to establish a baseline of Australia's comparative advantages, that is, what can we do best, and our competitiveness in those and other sectors. Now, don't be alarmed by this chart. Well, actually, you should be alarmed. But in accordance with convention, green is good and red is bad. I'll encourage you to read the detailed report and go through the line items. But the bottom line is that McKinsey found that Australia was only strongly competitive against the US, and they used the US as the benchmark economy in terms of productivity and innovation. Only strongly competitive in one sector of comparative advantage, and that's agriculture. But they did find that we had substantial comparative advantage, although flat or diminishing competitiveness in other sectors, being mining, including natural gas, tourism, international education, and potentially niche manufacturing, including food and beverage processing. Now, you can look at all that red on the McKinsey diagram and become very pessimistic about Australia's prospects. The BCA looked at it and saw enormous opportunity, but only if Australia changes its mindset and purposefully overcomes the barriers that McKinsey identified. And those barriers are, once again, our lack of global orientation and technological capability, regulation that is not fit for purpose in a globally competitive world, limited access to skilled, highly capable people, and our substandard capacity for collaboration. We should be shocked that we rank only 15th in the World Economic Forum Collaboration Index, whereas the US ranks 2nd and the UK ranks 5th. Now, while we know that this analysis has limitations, as McKinsey has acknowledged, we are releasing it to start a conversation which will enhance national understanding of our industry competitiveness. The BCA has taken the McKinsey research and prepared a discussion paper on why, and importantly how, to play to our comparative advantages. And that's the paper that you have in electronic form on your seats. Our paper calls for a fundamental shift in mindset from domestic to global, from final products to high-value, highly differentiated, niche, intermediate goods and services, and from qualifications and occupations to skills and capabilities. What the BCA is suggesting is a radical rethink of how Australia understands its economy and plans for wealth creation. Using the McKinsey findings, the BCA has analysed the role of Australian industry sectors in the economy and their capacity to grow in a global marketplace by grouping industry sectors into 4 categories with clear goals for each sector. Those which have a strong global growth outlook, where our goal should be to position the sector to achieve a globally significant presence. Those whose global growth outlook is relatively lower, but which are nonetheless critical to the economy, where the goal should be to lower production costs, increase productivity, and develop a platform for global growth. Those which are less critical, but nonetheless have a strong growth outlook, where the goal should be to remove impediments to growth. And finally, those which are in transition, where the goal should be to manage and facilitate the structural adjustment of their business models and/or identify skills which can be redeployed into more critical or competitive areas of the economy. The BCA is acutely mindful of the role of business in responding to the forces shaping our competitiveness. Our member companies are living this reality every day. But the idea that governments don't have a role in wealth creation and can leave it all to business ignores the reality that government controls key inputs into growth. Governments regulate, they set trade and immigration policy, they design markets, they plan and invest in infrastructure, and wield significant control over state and territory government decision-making. They also have a major role in skills development. The BCA is calling for a renewed understanding by government of its role, and for the next decade in particular, we are recommending government should focus on its key functions. The first of these is direction setting. It is a very important role of government to set a vision for the country. This is fundamental if we're to take the community on the difficult journey of change. Balancing the budget is not a vision. It's a means to an end, a necessary step to enable other changes to be made. Governments need to explain how decisions and policies will improve people's living standards over time. Secondly, government needs to develop a sector lens on the economy. This is not a matter of undertaking a one-off review. It's about developing and maintaining a deep understanding of the dynamics of the economy at the sector level and of the differential impact of global forces. This should be a core function of a highly empowered industry department, which the federal government has rightly created. Third, government should use what it learns from sector analysis to move from an intervention and subsidisation role to a facilitation and coordination role. Every policy, every program, every incentive, every enabling action of government should take careful account of how it will impact at the sector level and should be designed to support those business strategies in the sectors with our comparative advantage and help others to transition with minimum disruption. So, for example, government can pursue $1 billion worth of red tape reduction, but if the reform isn't substantive in terms of its impact at the sector level, if it doesn't fundamentally improve our global competitiveness, it's a wasted opportunity. The fourth responsibility of government is to build the innovation infrastructure needed to support the agility of the Australian economy. We would identify 6 key pillars of this infrastructure. There's physical infrastructure, where the recent budget confirmed the need for Australia to invest more strategically and made a helpful start. There's the financial system, where we have the Murray Review underway, and which we would urge to take account of the dynamics of the economy and the different investment funding needs. And there's appropriate institutional underpinnings, in particular taxation and regulatory settings. Here we have the Competition Policy Review underway, and the development of a white paper on tax reform has also been foreshadowed. So on these first 3 pillars, we are making progress. On the next 3, we are not. We need to recognise the concept of our knowledge infrastructure and its contribution to national competitiveness through the rise of knowledge and design-intensive business models. This knowledge infrastructure resides in our governments, in our universities, in our national facilities, in our companies, and is refreshed through R&D and skilled and talented people. And this leads to the next pillar. We must provide our people with the skills needed to participate in the digital economy and to embrace entrepreneurship. This is another much longer conversation, but nothing short of a major intervention and reset is required on this issue. And the final key pillar of our innovation infrastructure is, in fact, our industry sector landscape and the ability of business to absorb knowledge, take risks, and enter global supply chains. So when people talk about an innovation system, these are its key pillars. When they talk about structural reform, this is where it must focus, and particularly on the aspects of connectedness and collaboration among activities across these pillars. So in summary, government has a key role in enabling business to grow and create wealth, but it can no longer be a one-size-fits-all approach. It must be part of a strategic agenda that facilitates, enables and incentivises key sectors where Australia can succeed globally. But let's be absolutely clear that the approach we describe is not about picking winners, nor is it about delaying economic transition by propping up uncompetitive industries. And it's not about abandoning an economy-wide reform agenda either. It is about deliberate action to support those sectors where we can gain a competitive advantage and taking a more sophisticated view of structural reform. The approach we're putting forward today involves a very different model of policy design compared with what we've observed in Australia over the past 10 years. Policy design should be based on a deep understanding of the sector dynamics of the economy, including those where jobs are falling away and those where they're being created. Effective policy is based on data and evidence rather than ideology and anecdote. It seeks to understand the problem that it's trying to solve. It models second-order effects, and it has a mindset that constantly inquires into how policy will impact on the various elements and on the whole of a system. Importantly, effective policy recognises that people will change their behaviour in response to a policy. We can design for behavioural change or be surprised by it. A good start is for policymakers to ask the right questions for the right reasons at the right time. Looking back, if we'd asked the question about the automotive industry in the 1980s and acted purposefully as a consequence, we may have seen companies transition into niche suppliers participating in global supply chains rather than closing down. If we look forward, in agriculture, we should be asking ourselves whether we could do better by differentiating our niche, highly value-added products and tapping into emerging demand via global supply chains. This would lead to a set of strategic questions about how we align industry regulation and trade policy to support a clear objective of growing this strong, globally competitive sector. The slide that you are now looking at is a case in point. It illustrates the impact of what McKinsey describes as intent and ambition on the part of New Zealand in respect of its milk and dairy industry. In Australia's case, they describe our lack of intent and ambition as the story of squandered potential. You can see the line where Australia bumps along the bottom and New Zealand has taken off. We could also be asking questions now about our world-leading mining services sector. Is it adequately embracing data analytics, a capability which will determine its ongoing competitiveness? There is a view that it is not. None of what we propose can happen without far deeper cross-sector collaboration, not one-off consultation, but through permanent, continuous structures. While there is much room for improvement in the way businesses collaborate with each other and with the research sector, the first priority is to improve collaboration between business and government. From today, I will be asking 20 of Australia's leading companies to offer highly structured secondments for senior public servants with the aim of improving our mutual understanding of the forces impacting on business. We have to close the gap between what government thinks and what business knows. I will be making those calls over the next week, and I hope the Australian government and the state premiers will support the BCA in this important initiative. So to conclude, the forces that are shaping our world are very different from any that we have experienced before. They require different responses from government, from business, and indeed from us as individuals. Our time is running out and we need to act with a sense of urgency. If we don't, we're going to find ourselves slipping further behind, with the consequent loss of business capacity for growth and wealth creation, and an inevitable impact on living standards. Ultimately, our core comparative advantage is our people. We must equip them with the skills they need and ensure that they have the opportunity for meaningful jobs. The onus on our leaders is to understand the forces of change and Australia's enormous potential to succeed. Theirs is the responsibility of ensuring that the business model of our nation thrives in the global market rather than falling victim to it. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you for a terrific address on what might be Australia's comparative advantage going forward, and as one former Loreto girl to another. I wanted to ask you a question, if I might, about the Australian psyche. When Chris was speaking earlier about Israel wearing as a badge of honour, in a sense, failed businesses on the way to, obviously, the successful business, I thought of the oft-quoted dichotomy between fear of failure on the one hand and fear of opportunity lost on the other. And I just wonder, in an Australian context, if we're more taken by the fear of failure rather more than the fear of opportunity lost.
Thanks, Cathy. I mean, I think we regard failure, I think, as something that happens to us. Whereas if you look to, we look to the US where failure is applauded, that's failure through trying to do something but failing, whereas we think failure happens just spontaneously and in and of itself. One of the roles of government, I think, in terms of the whole direction and vision, is actually to showcase many more of our successes. I mean, there are an incredible number of successful companies. The large ones tend to be more obvious, but the smaller ones are not obvious. And when you look at them, they are just, they're amazing. But the stories behind those of individuals are individuals who failed while they've been trying, but then, of course, picked themselves up and ultimately succeeded. So many more role model case studies, I think, would go a long way to actually starting to shift the psyche. And I won't get onto it, but that actually does start with a greater understanding of risk-taking at the school level.
You focused a lot about the role of government and how it can improve that role. But there's a curious statistics in my mind that actually compares innovation and investment in Australia vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And not only do we invest less in innovation, in Australia about 2/3 of the innovation investment actually comes from government and only 1/3 from business, whereas if you compare it to other countries like the US, that ratio is reversed. Most of it comes from business and a much lesser proportion from government. What do you think Australia and Australian businesses can do to invest more in innovation?
Okay, thank you. The issue with those statistics is innovation is measured according to investment in R&D generally, and Australia does have a system where the investment in R&D is predominantly public, not private. That's in headline R&D. In fact, in innovation, when there are surveys of small business in particular in Australia and they say, no, we don't innovate, when you look at their business model, actually they've been hugely innovative. So innovation is about doing things differently, having a good understanding of your customer, working with your processes, your organisation structure, as well as using knowledge. And that's why the knowledge infrastructure is so important, and building our knowledge infrastructure. But a lot of knowledge in Australian business is actually imported through people and capital gear that is the result of innovation further down the supply chain. So I think there is a significant understatement of the level of innovation in the Australian economy, and that's innovation in business as distinct from the measure of the headline R&D it undertakes. Now, in no way do I want to diminish the importance of R&D. It's hugely important in building our innovation, in our knowledge infrastructure, but it is not the only indicator of innovation.
One question I have, Catherine, well, I have a number of questions, but one of them is we've set a base, the BCA has now set a baseline. It's set its programs, it's done its analysis. How do we actually move it on from here so that we actually get some action on everything as opposed to waiting another 2 years for another head of the BCA to come in, or 3 years, hopefully he'll be there for longer, but to come in. So how do we get baseline action? So for example, in Israel, compared to here, I use this as an example, we invested about $170 million in venture capital last year. Israel invested $2 billion, and it's a third of the population. So how do we move things along, in your opinion, for the platform that you've established?
Thanks, Kim. Well, as I said, I hope the Murray Review comes up with some very innovative solutions to our capacity to invest in the entrepreneurial sector. I think what the BCA will do is use this piece of work, and there's more work to be done on it. So it's a start. But what we'd like to do is have a series of roundtable conversations across the economy, not just with business, but also with government. We also plan to do a deeper analysis in individual sectors, starting with agriculture. And we would also like to use this work in terms of holding people to account for face value statements about the importance of growth and the importance of supporting growth.